anthropology. And so let's start with Andrzej Kisielewski. Title of presentation is Bronisław Malinowski's Social Anthropology as Anthropology of Arts.
I will speak from this place.
You can speak from this place, or you've got presentation?
No.
Okay, you can speak from this place, I think.
Hello, everybody.
Kamerę. Bo tutaj pan będzie mógł z tego miejsca.
At first, I should notice that I am not anthropologist and ethnologist, sociologist. Really sorry. I am an art historian, and my subject matter is avant-garde art in first half of 20th century. And we know that one of the origin of this kind of art, this art was a phenomenon named primitivism, and primitivism directed, of course, to ethnology. And in effect, now I am enthusiast of ethnology. And next notice, my presentation is only a kind of sketch or introduce to much wider problem, such as problems of art in works by Bronisław Malinowski. Bronisław Malinowski's social anthropology as anthropology of art. It seems that treating Bronisław Malinowski's social anthropology as anthropology of art proposed in the TAIC is not justified. However, art terms are permanently present in his monographs. In the monograph Coral Gardens under their magic, Malinowski wrote, the Trobriander is above all a gardener, who digs with pleasure and collects with pride, to whom accumulated food gives the sense of safety and pleasure in achievement, to whom the rich foliage of young wines or taro leaves is a direct expression of beauty. It is, as in many other matters, the Trobriander would agree with Stendhal's definition of beauty as the promise of bliss, rather than with a Kant emasculated statement about disinterested contemplation as the essence of aesthetic enjoyment. To the Trobriander, all that is lovely to the eye and to the heart, or as he would put it more correctly, to the stomach, which to him is the seat of the emotions, as well as understanding lies in things which promise to him safety, prosperity, abundance, and sensual pleasure. It is end of quotation. The sentence about Kant's emasculated statement may not only be evidence of a critical approach to the concept of art represented by the philosopher from Königsberg, but also of the fact that when describing the world of Trobriand Islanders...
Could you change the seat and sit there?
Yes, of course.
Thank you, because there is a camera and the people who are online cannot see you.
My idea to be disappeared.
I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Hello.
Hello.
I just cannot see you. This is something strange. I can hear you, not see you.
To jest podobny film. To pan nie widzi nas. The sentence about Kant's emasculated statement
may not only be evidence of a critical approach to the concept of art represented by the philosopher from Königsberg, but also of the fact that when describing the work of Trobriand islanders, Malinowski had defined opinions about art. What is not noticeable in his text are multiple remarks about the artistic values of the Trobriand crafts, and also plenty of reference to the European art, which proves that he was knowledgeable about its issue. Undoubtedly, he knows its latest trends in modern art, an example of which could be his references to the cubism in the monograph about coral gardens, or futurism in the monograph about the Kula ring. In the language of natives studied by Malinowski, there was no such word as art, just like the theory or history of art didn't exist in their world either. Therefore, his observation may be perceived as an example of decontextualization, situating the products of Trobriand's craft in the context of the European discourse of art. It should be added here that treating Malinowski's social anthropology as anthropology of art might also be perceived as decontextualization. It should be stated here that category art, both in the times of Malinowski's activity and today, is interpretative, evaluative, and universally character. But I am convinced that art is a universal cultural institution. Its more unambiguous substitute might be the term artistic culture, which I will use in my presentation. The foundation for defining evidence of material culture of non-European traditional societies as art, which took place at the turn of the 20th century, is the formalist theory of art, whose most influential representatives were Heinrich Wölfflin and Alois Riegel. Malinowski's remarks about the described and analyzed manifestations of material culture are clear evidence of the formalist approach. You may notice that the anthropologist himself adopts a contemplative Kantian perspective in reference to the various examples of evidence of artistic culture he describes, and often emphasize the quantitative approach of natives to the effects of their own, for example, gardening activity. This kind of approach, adopted by the anthropologist, was a starting point for his opinion. But it should be emphasized, however, it is very important that the scholar constantly transcended the confines of formalism. The formalist theory of art constitutes defense of form, or in fact of beauty. It is the beauty that seems to be a key importance, and that is why we may say that Malinowski's remarks about art, which are of interest to us here, mainly concern beauty. This can be confirmed by the quotation placed above, which the anthropologist compares Stendhal's and Kant's notions of beauty. In these considerations, we follow the path marked by Malinowski when creating the concept of functional anthropology. Having taken the mind pose a question: art as culture that is all that really the inhabitants of European islands. Therefore, it's a question about the role beauty plays in note islands. Some descriptions I can recommend. I call recall here names a researcher who have gone by way which showed Malinowski in his monographs. I recall here John Casai-Faloa, Giancarlo Massimo Giuseppe Scodidi. They are authors monographs about Trobriand art. And mainly Shirley Campbell from University in Canberra, who is author monograph titled The Art Cooler, very interesting. This effect of activity by. Let us add that the evidence of Trobriand artistic culture exists in the art. The Trobriand art is basically expressed in craft. Its evidence are musical instrument, carved wooden dishes, spoons ornamented, ebony carved lime spatulas, ritual masks and shields, carved boards adorning to prows and sterns of canoes, etc. Although some same carved figures were identified as evidence of art, but they had no source in the Trobriand tradition. They were specially prepared for sale for tourists. Let's emphasize, however, that the art discourse should also involve Trobriand dances, ritual songs, and choral gardening. In my presentation, I would like to focus only on two examples of Trobriand artistic culture, the Massawa canoes and choral gardening. The sea-going Massawa canoes used in the Kula Ring are one of the most distinctive examples of the artistic culture from the Trobriand Islands. They were extremely attractive object in the aesthetic sense. Malinowski stated that were a marvelous, almost miraculous achievement and a thing of beauty. They delivered with their tasteful design, which, apart from the shape with a characteristic sail, also included rich sculptural ornamentation complemented by decorative painting. The visual forms were additionally enriched with audio effects thanks to array shells hung out in ropes for decoration in the prow part of the canoe, clanking when blown by the wind and to the movement of waves. In the Argonauts of the Western Pacific, we can find a detailed description of the process of creating the Massawa canoe. Malinowski writes about selecting material for its construction, that is a tree to be felled, and the preceding magical rituals. He describes the transportation of a wooden log to the village and further gives a very detailed account of the canoe making process. What we also find here is a description of sculpting and decorative painting. The anthropologists present the magical rites and ceremonial accompanying each stage of work. This detailed description, the canoe making, may be treated as documentation on artwork creating process. However, reducing the Massawa canoe to the role of artwork understood in a formalist way that is an object of aesthetic contemplation doesn't meet the criteria for the Trobriand artwork. In fact, it does not give its full picture. Sorry. According to Malinowski's description, the canoes were not only beautiful and evidently useful products of craftsmanship, but were also bound up with the whole system of Trobriand institutions of culture and enjoyed a special social status. They were treated as members of a rural community, therefore as living things. They had their names and genealogy. Each newly built canoe was perceived as another incarnation of the preceding one, which went out of use, and by reason of that, its name became the name of its successors. Each canoe was bound by mysterious threads to different aspects of the daily life of islanders. For instance, a slowing down of a canoe in the time of a deep sea journey was an evident sign that the canoe owners, Tolivagi's wife, committed misconduct in the time of his absence. The canoes were endowed with superhuman qualities, and for that reason they were situated on the border of the world of sense and extrasensory perception, which Mircea Eliade called a historical reality. Malinowski showed the Massawa canoe in the context of a complex system of institutions making up the Trobriand culture. These institutions were its social structure and family life, myths, magic, religion, rituals, craft, etc. A significant institution of the Trobriand culture was a deep sea journey in a canoe, and further made possible thanks to it the Kula exchange with the commitment trade exchange. Malinowski also described the emotional attitudes of the natives to the canoe and showed it in the context of their beliefs. An example of them may be the images of fires flickering in the waves, stones sprouting out from underwater, endangering the deep sea fleet, and the convictions about the existence of flying sea witches and monsters that could drag the canoe underwater. Coral gardens may also be perceived as work of art. In his famous monograph devoted to them, Malinowski discusses in detail the process of their evaluation, stretched over time, multi-layered and multi-faceted. It is short quotation. The gardens are in a way a work of art, exactly as a native will take an artist's delight in constructing a canoe or house perfect in shape, decoration and finish, and the whole community will glory in such an achievement. Exactly thus will he go about lying hour and developing of his garden. It emerges from the anthropologist's description that gardening was not an isolated activity, but one of the many closed, tight elements of reality perceived by the islanders as a whole. Gardening could be linked to such institutions as family, magic, religion, law, craftsmanship, trade exchange, rites, rituals, etc. It was related to emotion and fear for survival. It also served representation, expressing vanity of garden owners, and at the same time social communication, also allowing for contact with a historical reality. It conditioned contact with soil, which, as Malinowski observed, had a special place in the imagination of islanders. The the complex system of Trobriand myths established close relations of people with soil. It was from the ground where the first people emerged. They brought garden magic from there. It was where dwelt their ancestors' spirit called Baloma, which entered women's bodies, getting them pregnant. and then appeared a human reincarnation of their ancestors. Contact with soil was an experience of life energy permeating the cultivated plants. And conclusion. Bronisław Malinowski's account shows that the boundaries of the sphere of art in the Trobriand Islands were not sharp. It constantly intermingled with other institutions of Trobriand culture, based on the anthropologist assumptions that specific institutions of culture are intended to satisfy needs. We might now try to specify the functions of Trobriand art, the image of which we can find in his monographs. We may say that it formed a concise visual system with many functions. First of all, it had a life purpose. It was a tool in the fight for survival. It served to strengthen the influence of magic, which was essential both when building a seagoing canoe and gardening. It was evidence of religious thinking and allowed for transgressing the boundaries of daily life and entering the historical reality. It made it possible to explain the reality and was at the same time a tool to influence it, allowing for control of the natural powers. It had communicative, representative functions, but also served aesthetic contemplation. In the Trobriand Islands, art was realistic in the sense that the repertoire of forms and therefore the beauty, usually ornamental in nature, was derived from the natural environment. Based on Malinowski's account, it might be inferred that it was intended to continue, relate, and evident formal solution and express things known for generation. Last sentence. It was ahistorical because it was placed in the rigid frame of magical and religious rituals, beliefs, and convictions passed from generation to generation, and as consequence, there was no place for avant-garde rebellion, growth, or modification. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Now will be online presentation of Witold Jacórzyński. Hello, do you hear us, Witold?
Yes.
Hello, we don't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Just wait a second, okay?
Yes. Yes, please. Just a second. If you can hear me, just please say it.
Okay.
Oh. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, but not see you.
Why not? If I put my camera on, so why you cannot see me? It is the question. Okay.
Turn on the camera.
Yes, I put on my camera, and I cannot understand why you cannot see me. No. Because I can see myself. Yes. That's it. Okay. Why it is not possible? Who knows? Okay.
Still, we cannot see you.
You cannot see me, and this is something enigmatic to me. I do not know why, because I can see myself right now. Anyway, just not to prolong the way,
Do you have...
not to...
Do you have lecture or presentation? Just lecture. Okay, so there's no camera. Cannot see you. You can start.
You cannot see me. Okay.
Yeah, but you have to
something
start now.
French. Oh, but you can hear me. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me, so I can present what's my paper. So, thank you very much for inviting me to this report. It shows that Malinowski thought is not dead, that it is very actual. And of course I think it is actual because of some reasons. And in this paper I would like to pinpoint 3 different reasons for Malinowski's being actual. They are like 3 pillars of something which was built up in anthropology of today, and it is not swept away with time. The first pillar of Malinowski's actuality is his functionalism, but not functionalism. Yes. Can you hear me? Because I
we can hear you.
do not follow. Okay. So the functional theory is not the best of Malinowski. What is the best is something which follows it, which I call following Ernest Gellner. We would call it like corrupted servant. Corrupted servant for Malinowski and for Gellner is a history. History is a corrupted servant. This is the first pillar. The second pillar of Malinowski's greatness would be his philosophy of language, which is very important, and it has been omitted in many publications. Can you follow me? Sorry, because I can't see.
Yeah, you can.
Something. Okay. So the second pillar would be the philosophy of language, which is expressed in a supplement. It is called supplement, not preface. It is called supplement to Ogden's and Richard's book, The Meaning of Meaning, from 1923, in which Malinowski expressed his views about philosophy of language, basing himself on what was called the study of savage language. Almost nobody except Ernest Gellner mentions this apportation important to anthropology and to philosophy of language by Malinowski. This is the second pillar. And the third pillar of wisdom, let's say, following the analogy with 7 pillars of wisdom by Lawrence, in Malinowski, the third pillar would be an anti-nationalist stand. So he was Polish who was against Polish. So I would like to get into those 3 points, pillars of Malinowski. Malinowski greatness in anthropology and in philosophy. First of all, the meaning of meaning. The authors of the book, which was a very important book in the history of philosophy, The Meaning of Meaning, Ogden and Richards, they said, to Dr. Malinowski, the authors owe a very special debt. His return to England as they work. Okay, so they are admiring in the preface. What was the Malinowski contribution to the philosophy of language enhanced by Ogden and Richards? This is my question. Malinowski starts with a decisive question. Imagine yourself suddenly transported onto coral atoll in the Pacific, sitting in the natives and listening to their conversation. Let us assume further that theirs is an ideal interpreter at hand, who, as far as possible, can convey the meaning of each utterance. Okay, so I couldn't but quote Malinowski. I do not want to read, so that I can borrow you.
I cannot hear you.
You cannot hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Could you take your microphone closer to mouth or something?
Right now? Better?
We see.
Can you hear me better?
Yep, now yeah.
Okay. It is because I... Okay, so the first pillar of Malinowski's contribution to anthropology and to philosophy is his philosophy on language. I will be summarizing what I thought to be the main question. Not reading, because I have right now like 10 pages to read. So please forgive me not to read those pages. Later on I can send them. Okay. The first pillar is his contribution to the philosophy of language. What is important? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What is important from Malinowski's point of view is that in his studies about language and languages of so-called primitive people from Trobriand Islands and other peoples in the world, was that what was manifested is that every sense of the utterance, linguistic utterance, has its meaning not because what it says, but because what is surrounded by it. What is surrounded means context. Contextere means surrounded. But for Malinowski, it was many things. He doesn't offer us any theory of context. But he mentions context as something very important. Context is what we say and how we say. What we say depends on how we say. Our dreams, our eyes, our gestures, our whatever. And also the situation. So Malinowski calls this context situation, following Ogden and Richards. This theory for us, it probably sounds banal or sounds primitive or childish, but in that time it was something original, and Malinowski was original. What was original was stressed upon by last Wittgenstein. And last Wittgenstein expressed the same what Malinowski in 23 expressed very well in this supplement to Ogden and Richards' book, The Meaning of Meaning. Wittgenstein did it in maybe the 30s of the last century. So Gellner was an inspiration, a great inspiration to think about Malinowski. He said exactly this. So Malinowski said what Wittgenstein said 10 years later, or this is important. Okay, the second pillar of Malinowski's thought, which is original and which is worth following, is what we might call anti-historicism, or the philosophy of history, functionalist theory of history. Malinowski, in his first great book, which we all know, the Argonauts of Western Pacific, he stated explicitly there, we do not need any history in ethnographic research, because history is based on speculative facts. So history is something which we cannot touch. It is not empirical. History is no empirical research, no empirical discipline. And
ancestors have legitimate reasons for concern, for grievance. Regarding the lady Massa, means something that made us all very, very sad. Similar incidents happen all around the world, like tons of examples similar to that in the United States or in the UK. He insisted Iran is
Hello?
okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you because we didn't hear you.
Microphone.
We can hear you now.
Okay, okay. So I'm finishing. The second pillar of Malinowski's actuality is his functional theory of a discipline about the past, because there is no discipline which is empirical about the past. The past is not touchable. It's not empirically valuable. So it is something which we cannot grasp if we part from empirical premises. This is what Malinowski says about history. History is important as well as we can feel it. we know a lot of countries. Among those countries, Poland is one of them, which admires or either admires or abolishes their monuments. Yes, the history, in fact, does not exist as a discipline of the past. It exists as a discipline of the present. So we can think about the past, think in present, and studying the function of the past in the present. So this is very original and astonishing, as well as radical in Malinowski's thought. And the third pillar, and the last one, that would be his nationalist stand, nationalist and anti-stand, because he was anti-nationalist in a sense. I refer to some texts by Malinowski which are not so much mentioned, not so much questioned, not so much discussed, for different reasons. And one of those reasons is that those questions are not politically correct. What is not politically correct, especially in Poland, is the question of what is nationhood, what is nation. Malinowski was of the view that the nation is something real. Of course, it is something real for him, but it is real in very cultural sense. So we are nation, one nation, share our legends, our myths, our tales of our our folk, what is called folk. But at the same time, the nation is not what shall define our political unity. This is very important in Malinowski. Malinowski was an admirer of dual monarchy of Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he said, this was the ideal. We need a state which is absolutely plural, liberal, and democratic. We do not need any state which is national, one only nationalistic. Nationalist is something which is absolutely awful, horrible, and we shall omit it. This is something which is original, something which admired so much Ernest Gellner about Malinowski, and he follows him in this. So we shall be nationalists in cultural sense, and we shall not be nationalists in political sense. This was the point. Okay, so I mentioned three pillars of Malinowski's thought, which seems to me that it is something original and something important for philosophical as well as anthropological thought. Okay, thank you very much if you heard me.
Thank you very much. And now the last presentation. Now the time from Marcin Jacek Kozłowski. Title of presentation is Continuity, Revolution or Contextualization, Malinowski Oaxaca Project. And Please, Witold, stay with us and turn off the microphone.
Hi everyone, I would like first thank you for invitation. Secondly, introduction phase of my investigation concerning vinculation between Malinowski and Mexican indigenism. So in 1940, Bronisław Malinowski arrived in Mexico, drawn by an interest in comparing process of the social change in the Mexican countryside. Question that he studied a few years earlier in Africa. He received support to conduct fieldwork during the summers of 1940 and 1941. And his first season had been planned for 1942. The work of the peasant market system and the regional economic of the Valley of Oaxaca left uncompleted at his death. His relation to the Latin America and Latin American anthropology has limited just to the Mexican adventure, as we saw, or some of it, in Professor Postan-Zieliński's presentation. By his Mexican adventure, it was fifth visit of the American continent, since in 1926 he had traveled to the United States for a period of 6 months. As a guest of the Rockefeller Foundation, and then as a professor of summer course of the University of California, Berkeley. On this trip, he also visited Mexico for the first time and met Manuel Gamio. So from this time, we can say about his encounter with Latin American doll. In 1936, after completing his seminars on cultural change at the London School of Economics, he made a second visit on the occasion of the commemoration of the Harvard Tricentenary, in which he served as a representative of the University of London, where his honor doctorate was conferred. On the third trip, at the beginning of 1938, he arrived as a professor of the University of Arizona. That gave him chance to visit Hopi Indians reservations and late make short stays among indigenous groups of northern Mexico and the Mexican capital. In the period 1938 to 1939, the outbreak of the Second World War made difficult for Malinowski to return to the position he held since 1922. First as a permanent reader in anthropology, and 5 years later as a chair in the field of anthropology in London. Thus, in 1939, he visited Havana, Cuba, for the first time, where he met Fernando Ortiz y Fernandez, a prominent Cuban anthropologist with whom he would maintain friendship and an intellectual exchange. Malinowski would remember this trip years later, alluding of affinities with the way of thinking of Cuban anthropologists, of whom he borrowed from the term transculturation to contrast Herskovits's term acculturation. It is what Malinowski said in the preface to Ortiz's book. I would cite some of it. So when at last I met Fernando Ortiz during my first visit to Havana in November 1929, I was a source of pleasure and profit to me, take greater advantage of his time and patience that is generally considered permissible of such acquaintance. As might have been expected, we often discussed those most interesting of phenomena, these exchanges of culture and the impact of civilization on the other. Dr. Ortiz told me that the time his next book, he was planning to introduce a new technical word the term transculturation to replace various expressions in such as cultural exchange, acculturation, diffusion, migration, or osmosis of culture. And the similar ones that considered inadequate, my instant response was enthusiastic acceptance of this neologism. In September 1939, he returned to United States as a visiting professor at the Yale University. Malinowski continued to nurture his ties with the Hispanic intelligentsia by receiving, for example, a visit from his friend Fernando Ortiz. This meeting is related by Jose Juan Arom, another Cuban who worked at the jail. A year after the meeting with Ortiz, he obtained financing from Carnegie Foundation and arrived by boat at the port of Veracruz, from where he traveled to country's capital to meet with sponsoring Mexican committee. After preliminary discussions with the representatives of National Institute of Anthropology and recognized trip to the city of Oaxaca, Malinowski decided to study the market system of the Valley of Oaxaca, which drew the inhabitants of Indian and peasant village with a wide radius of mestizo city and the process of regular interaction and exchange recalling for the anthropologist observer. The phenomenon met all the requirements of Malinowski's particular functionalist paradigm. In a single institution, or one could encounter interviewed that the threats of the entire culture, which could be painstakingly unwound in order to examine the relation of the parts of the whole. Although structural functionalism tend for its inception to restrict anthropological observation to cultural phenomena at the level of the isolable local community, such a narrow delineation of intellectual boundaries had never been entirely feasible with engineering. In part because of applied nature, in part because the land's long-standing association with the tradition of anthropological particularism, indigenismo from the time of Manuel Jamio onward have been constantly characterized by underlying concern with the delineation of culture areas. What had not been accomplished with the culturist framework of indigenismo in the pre-war period, however, was a construction of theoretical link between Indians and non-Indians living in the close geographical proximity. It was the thing to look at the livelihood of Nahuatl groups whose village could be identified with a given segment of the map of Mexican nation, but quite another to consider how they might materially interact with rural and the urban mestizo neighbors. Interestingly enough, the first step toward dealing with such a question and the process emphasizing the role of the nations of non-Indians in determining significant material elements of Indian livelihood were taken at the turn of 1940 during the course of collaboration between the outstanding and conservative European functionaries who specially dissociated his approach from the Chicago school, and the radical young indigenista who was have long professional ties. So what was the radical young, who was the radical young indigenista that abandoned Malinowski at work? Julio de la Fuente was born in San Lorenzo de los Negros, now Yanga, a town founded by escaped slaves from Caribbean islands and placed in Mexican states of Veracruz. From a young age, de la Fuente made clear his sympathies for the underprivileged and was drawn to the rebellion of class conflicts. In the early 1920s, he became involved with the tenant movement in Veracruz. He was editing and illustrating its bulletin. He then traveled to Mexico to study chemistry at the National University of Mexico, but left it in 1926 and took a job in a factory. In 1928, he moved to New York, where he joined an anti-imperialist league and worked as an illustrator, painter, and translator. The Great Depression brought him back to Veracruz, where he became a rural teacher and worked with the League of Agrarian Communities, which represented his first sustained contact with peasant communities. In 1935, he helped found and directed the League of Revolutionary Writers and Artists. In 1936, De La Fuente lost an eye in a traffic accident, and from then he left behind his work as an artist and decided to be an activist. Well, it was some of the context that you should know. You should know analyzing that book, which was a unique book. It was written in some collaboration that co-authored that Malinowski has co-authored. I would like to mention three basic principles, three basic things that I considered important in the economics of the market system in Mexico. So the first principle is the principle of documentation by means of concrete evidence. That first point involves documentation based on the description of the concrete evidence, which implies the emptying of the first observation of raw data, as discussed in his three-column chart and as we know, remembered and criticized by Gluckman. I would like to quote Malinowski. The task would seem simple. We might rewrite our notes, make a full inventory of the various dealings, give vivid impression of sight, movement, and even smell, show the medley of goods and types and thither and thither of the people, and illustrate it with a few photographs. The principle that shows Malinowski seeks to give meaning, and it's not just collection of the concrete facts. Let me recall that Malinowski understands significance as a relationship between elements which cannot give by isolation or separating from their context, especially I mean his explanation for survivals. I will quote Malinowski, there is no doubt that the survival endures because it was acquired a new meaning, a new function. But unless we adopt some definitely moral and valuational attitude, instead of studying the phenomenon as it now occurs, we would supply give an incorrect description of its uses and its significance. For the reconstruction of the context, Malinowski and De La Fuente recovered the historical interest in the functional method in order to account the functioning of the system. It is appropriate to say that this is a substantial and paradigmatic element that breaks with the ahistorist idea and characterized the Malinowski functionalist method centered on the search of for the satisfaction of the needs. This incorporation of historic aspect in functionalism could be influenced and developed by contact with Latin America context. That idea was expressed by himself in 1939 in response to Herskovit's criticism, and as a cook and young mark, Malinowski had come to the realization that functionalism needs to stand in opposition to a historical approach, that they were indeed complementary. However, Malinowski was unable to develop fully historical dimension of functionalism due to his premature death, but some of we can observe their text summarizing Mexican adventure. The functional method is not the way, I'm quoting Malinowski, the functional method is not the way opposed to any legitimate historical approach. It attempts to widen and deepen the historical point of view rather than discount it. So I have just 5 minutes. I haven't passed for all three aspects of what I considered important in an apportation contribution of Malinowski in Oaxaca project, but I should present some conclusions. So Malinowski Mexican fieldwork couldn't revolutionize his functionalism, but contextualization of his study on the market system in Oaxaca had some important implications. Malinowski was a product of his times, as admitted Waterbury, and he was enfant fatal, as marked Herskovits. His previous work on Triobriand Icelanders gave him fame and appreciation, so he could resign and abandon easily his functional ideas. As marks Waterbury, he arrived in Mexico as the master ethnographer who came to teach, not to be taught. But there are other reasons that he could adapt fully, that he couldn't adapt fully his functionalism. His study of Oaxaca markets was both topically and regionally very broad. The research team was small and improvised. Short time of fieldwork couldn't help. Short time of fieldwork couldn't help. Spread over 2 summers, some 23 weeks, couldn't present material that we can compare with his work done in Triobriand Islands. But in a more practical sense, Oaxaca project has, or it could, oriented Mexican indigenism to focus on regional economic centers rather than in individual villages or cities. Study of Oaxacan markets shows that effort of integration programs should be based on so-called solar system model. By 1938, in INI, Instituto Nacional Indigenista, was established, and the responsibility of attending to the Indian groups of the country was definitely placed in the hands of anthropologists. Much of the INI energy during this period was devoted to creation of regional coordinating centers, from which services could be disseminated. It was a model based on the cultural diffusion designed to promote Spanish language education, health programs, industrial farming techniques, tourists, arts, and closer economic integration between indigenous regions and national markets. The INI sought to break the isolation of indigenous villages by ending their economic self-sufficiency and making them dependent on the regions and the nation. This approach followed directly from the work of Malinowski and De La Fuente, particularly in its structural functionalism and acculturationist approach. Its emphasis on regions and its use of market towns and sites for coordinating centers. Such a center in second or third localization called La Cabanita was house of Centro Coordinador Indigenista Tzotzil and placed in the San Cristobal de las Casas. In the early 30s, in the early 50s of 20th century, it was directed by Julio de la Fuente. I have spent long time during my fieldwork dedicated to indigenous leaders from Chinelo there. It was other moment when Sam Paul discovered work of Julio de la Fuente, first remembered as Malinowski collaborator, and secondly as a fierce social activist devoted to equilibration of social differentiations. One of the side of the study of the Oaxaca market was on the one side, study of Oaxaca market was orphanated by death of modern anthropology, founding father. On the other side, work was abandoned by a proletarian of the science, un proletarario de la ciencia, as a friend quote of de la Fuente. Malinowski
last sentence, please. Okay.
Yeah. Malinowski in 1920s and much of 1930s was an ethnographer working alone, but at the end of the 30s and early 40s, he was changing his strategy and begins to link his local with the local anthropologists. Thank you.
Thank you for your lectures. And now it's time for Kingas as a discussant. And please, your comments, feedbacks for our speakers.
Thank you. Thank you very much. The title of this panel was Multidimensional Inspiration of Bronisław Malinowski, Bronisław Malinowski's Anthropology. And indeed, I think we've seen this multidimensionalism here. We had the analysis of art, the meaning of beauty, the meaning of language in the second presentation, nation, and his approach to his empirical research. Did he evolve, did he shift, or did he revolutionize that? And I think what is common to those, I won't delve into the three presentations because they're so rich and there's a lot of detail in that, but I think we can find common themes like the problem of context and decontextualization. How can we use categories, external categories for discussing like art? Is it separate or is it interwoven into other institutions? But since the title of the conference is The Legacy of Bronisław Malinowski in Present-Day Times for Social Sciences and Humanities, I was also thinking that this multidimensional aspect is interesting in the way, and this has been present in many lectures here, in the way he practiced science and his thought. And I will speak about what is close to me in a way because I've worked for years in science policy. So I was wondering how can we think about Malinowski from the present day? So there are at least three buzzwords in science policy. One is science communication, the other is interdisciplinarity, and the third one is teamwork. And I think these were present here or hinted in many ways. Like science communication, if we think about science as such, one of the problems that has been mentioned quite often is the dry tone of scientific papers, which we have to struggle with as readers. And as opposed to that, we've got Malinowski, who was no stranger to art, not only visual arts, but also the belles-lettres, and his aspiration, his fascination for Joseph Conrad, for Émile Zola. And if we look at one of the entering sentences of the Argonauts, who the title itself is very evocative for a European reader, again, this context, the contextualization, this famous sentence, imagine yourself suddenly set down, surrounded by all your gear, alone in a tropical beach. This, in essence, is like a textbook example of what the neurolinguist Steven Pinker says, the classical prose style. It's a conversation between the writer and the reader. So I think, like, if we were thinking what we can draw from Malinowski in that respect, what is problematic for science right now is the ability to communicate his research to a broader public, which incidentally also is very in a description of Ernest Gellner, who had a seductive language, very convincing, very compelling. Much has been said here about many oppositions, like art, emotive versus rational concept of that. The research, ahistorical, historical. The struggle probably Malinowski was as ideographic or nomothetic. And if we look at those oppositions, one of those which came quite often was also the one of paradox of national versus cosmopolitan. And I think much has been said about both Gellner and Malinowski as a product of the situation in the relation to the concept of nationalism and nation. But I think it's also quite interesting to think of Malinowski as a native to anthropology, but cosmopolitan to knowledge. And what I found through all the presentations, very interesting, even when you've been describing just recently, Juan de la Fuente, is that he was surrounded by people he was not only himself versed in many disciplines, but he was surrounded by people of various knowledge. We've heard several hours ago about the lawyers, the legal thinkers he was in contact with. We have obviously Witkiewicz, prolific artist. We have Leon Fistek, the great mathematician. And maybe Malinowski was in the time where it was easier to know more from other disciplines. But now with the knowledge growing exponentially, it's difficult. But maybe this is another lesson to look at other disciplines also. Yet we hear that sociology and anthropology do not recite each other because they go separately. So let alone physics, for example. But I think this is something which is really admirable. And also, I think that has appeared here, but maybe not explicitly, was the teamwork, not acknowledged like today we would acknowledge it, but he wrote in a beautiful English, which was not his first language. He owed that probably to Elsie, his wife. And there are many people who he had talent to probably find, those people who were very inspiring, and from knowing a lot from different disciplines, but also knowledgeable about the cultures they lived in. So I wonder whether that might be also a legacy, this interdisciplinarity of Malinowski would be something worth pursuing.
Thank you so much, Kinga. Any of speakers want to comment the Kinga's feedback? Okay, please.
I have to underline that I am a historian, and my perspective is very concrete. Legacy, Malinowski legacy, it is a very interesting problem from the perspective of contemporary art and art history. Because now, I think now about last 10 or 20 years it is we can observe a second wave of interest in primitive art. Primitive art, of course, it is a very bad name, but artists discovered second time, because first time it was a time of avant-garde art in the 20s or the first decade of 20th century. But artists very often now are inspiring native arts. Native arts, I think it will be more concrete, more better word. But in this time, I observe a discovery of primitive art by art historian, because art history, it is very often I meet this opinion. Art history is in a state of crisis now. Effects, evidence of this crisis can be functioning of visual arts, for example. But art historians very often discovered now a text by anthropologists of culture. Art historians very often go on the way which showed us Ebbe Warburg in the beginning of the 20th century. I think in this background we can speak about legacy of Malinowski. Malinowski is very actually author now. I think that recognize this what I named anthropology of art by Malinowski. It is a kind of provocation, of course, but it can be very interesting area for art historians or for artists too, because this Malinowski's anthropology of culture, of art, can be very interesting background, kind of mirror for contemporary art, for situation of artists, for situation of art as a cultural institution in modern technical culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annie. Okay, so it's time for open discussion and question from audience, please.
Okay, just at the beginning, one not a
please
question.
take a microphone.
Okay. Sorry. Just at the beginning, one comments to your commentary concerning cosmopolitanism. It is a very broad term, and we have a different kind of such attitude. So it's not. It's quite difficult to label some person as cosmopolitan. During my studies and stays in the United States, I was struck by such an expression, quite common among academia in the United States universities, that it was in the 70s and 80s that some professors said at the time that in the United States we have a lot of ethnic groups, Polish Americans, Mexican Americans, Greek Americans, etc., plus one special group, academia. international cosmopolitan academia. So I realized that the people in academia represent a special kind of cosmopolitanism, which is not the same as a guy who is migrant, who is deprived, who is migrant from one country to another country, but who is a migrant from across the many countries and really don't know exactly who he is. Just in the book on Malinowski, you participated as a contributor. Jacórzyński was one of the editor of this book. It's a chapter written of one of my students from Poznań University, who just in the very short description of his person stated that I have two nationalities, but I have two citizenship and two passports, but no nationality, because he is just a son of the Polish German family, study in Paraguay, and Namibia is now involved as a teaching professor in South Africa and so on. So it is a typical cosmopolitan from the academia, but also from the background. And he identified himself as a guy without nationality. But returning to the core of our session, I would like to ask some questions to Marcin Kozłowski, plus add some information. The question one, when I talk to some Mexican anthropologists and let's say South American anthropologists, maybe, I don't know if it's true or not, what is really the basis, but it's quite often opinion among Latin American anthropologists that the contribution of the project of Oaxaca of Juan de la Fuente was much bigger than Malinowski, and it's not justified that the world, Anglo-Saxon world, especially since 1982, when the book on Oaxaca was first time issued in London, that the broad audience able to read in this book in English really identified the result as an effort of intellectual work of Malinowski. So it is the first question. What do you think? What is the Juan Fuente y Malinowski contribution to this combined book? It will be interesting, the question. The second is, it is very interesting, thank you, that you pointed out that moment, some kind of connection between Malinowski's functionalism and the discovery of the importance of the history. What is your opinion? It is just the effect of the common work in Oaxaca, or just more generally, it is an effect of better knowledge of Malinowski after coming to a few times to Mexico, to Cuba, and to other countries, that he discovered that it's impossible to ignore history for ethnographers, for anthropologists. Looking just now at the anthropology of the Latin American countries, there is absolutely no way for any kind of anthropologist to ignore history. So the history, the ethnohistory is the part of anthropology, not the part of history. Even the people who, some of my students who are involved in studies of, let's say, peoples with no history, I'm referring to Amazonia, for instance, they are attached so deeply into ethnohistorical studies that they try to reconstruct both levels of history. Let's say the real history, which happened from one generation to another generation, and the imagined history, the life history, which is, let's say, present by the storytellers. But even in such a situation of the people without history, the ethnohistory is very, very important. And the last question: do you know something about the field notes of Malinowski from Oaxaca? They were published or know where they are, storage, and maybe along with the field notes there are some photographs. I can't imagine that they did some fieldwork in Zapotecan villages without cameras. It would be quite strange. Even in the second half of the 19th century, the people, the ethnographers used the special kind, very heavy camera, and left in archives glass photographs, let's say. So it's my and one question,
Professor, we've got comment. 3 minutes, okay. And give our private speakers to answer to you. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Well, I finding difficulties to respond to your questions. But first of all, how we can prove the participation or equilibration of De La Fuente, contribution of De La Fuente and Malinowski in this work? It's my question. The third question, yes, there are published photographs from, I think there is an archive of Juan de la Fuente in Mexico, or archive of photos. So there is no problem with finding them. I think there is 2 or 3 photographs of Malinowski sitting with Zapotecs.
Published or unpublished?
Published in the version of English version of Economia, and the row of history. It's could you repeat, please, your question about history?
No. I wonder if, let's say, the discovery that the history is also possible to combine with the functionalism approach aroused during the Malinowski's activity in Oaxaca. It was just, a early discovery of Malinowski.
I think there are proofs that he doesn't. He was thinking about history, and he was thinking about use history somehow in his. Or he had a special way to understand history. I think so. That's my.
Or maybe it is the effect of the conversation and collaboration with Juan de la Fuente. I don't know.
No.
Well, I'm in the. I would like to investigate it.
It's a good idea.
So we've got only 1 minute, and we have to go to the finish.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah. Okay. So the time is over, and we are stay here because there will be a film of Jerzy Domaracki, Noble Savage, and after projection will be a discussion with Jerzy Domaracki. So thank you so much for your lectures and discussion. Thank you.
Niech pan na razie na majka na...
Proszę?
Niech pan na razie wyłączy majka. Mikrofon.